I mentioned it's the biggest story in the world, the effort to manufacture and distribute the coronavirus vaccine. Now, here in the US, the rollout has been surprisingly quick, but the vaccine rollout globally has been remarkably unequal, as the world's richest countries have gotten the vast majority of the world's vaccines, while COVID still rages on in places like Brazil and India, which is seeing a staggering number of cases and deaths in the last few weeks. Well, this week saw some big news on that front.
President Biden siding with leaders across the globe to waive pharmaceutical giants' patents on COVID-19 vaccines. This is really important. U.S. Trade Representative Katherine Tai made the announcement yesterday, saying the Biden administration's goal is to, quote, get as many safe and effective vaccines to as many people as fast as possible. The move could help save thousands of lives in countries like India and Brazil, where officials are grappling to contain new waves of the coronavirus.
That's right. The Biden administration reversed its position from just a month ago when it blocked an initiative led by India and South Africa at the WTO to waive COVID vaccines patent protections. This came after months of massive pressure from the global south. It also came shortly after a video of candidate Biden promising healthcare activist Ady Barkan that he would waive all patent restrictions on the vaccine while he was on the campaign trail.
The World Health Organization is leading an unprecedented global effort to promote international cooperation in the search for COVID-19 treatments and vaccines. But Donald Trump has refused to join that effort, cutting America off from the rest of the world. If the U.S. discovers a vaccine first, will you commit to sharing that technology with other countries? And will you ensure there are no patents to stand in the way of other countries and companies mass producing those life-saving vaccines?
Absolutely, positively. This is the only humane thing in the world to do. This guy's whole idea of America on its own is meant America alone. We're out there by ourselves. What's he doing? It lacks any human dignity, what we're doing. So the answer is yes. Yes, yes, yes. And it's not only a good thing to do, it's overwhelmingly in our interest to do it as well. Overwhelmingly.
Thank you for that commitment.
So yes, yes, yes. At first, the Biden administration did not fulfill its promise, but like I said, it reversed course. Now, the pharmaceutical companies were obviously not happy about the news as their stock price collapsed within minutes of the Biden administration's announcement.
Vaccine makers taking a hit in the last hour of trading after the Biden administration said it supports waiving patent protections for COVID vaccines. That would effectively hand over the secret recipe for these life-saving vaccines to other manufacturers, possibly in other countries, to make them. Shares of Pfizer, Moderna, Novavax all dropping sharply from their highs of the day.
Now, the news came as a genuine shock given the U.S.'s history in enforcing drug patents around the world, especially with regards to Africa's efforts to manufacture desperately needed HIV drugs in the 1990s. And the American as well as European position to vaccine patent restrictions came in stark contrast to China and Russia, the countries who our media constantly tells us are the big bad evils in the world, but have actually been engaging in vaccine diplomacy.
These countries have pre-ordered nearly 4 billion doses of coronavirus vaccines from Western drug makers. Some wealthy nations have even secured enough doses to cover every person in the country multiple times. But developing countries that don't have much money to buy vaccines or the technology to develop their own are at risk of being left behind with nothing. So China and Russia are stepping in with vaccine diplomacy. In one deal, Beijing will sell coronavirus vaccines to Pakistan in exchange for testing them in the country.
Official statements from Beijing suggest a willingness to blur their humanitarian and foreign policy objectives.
While Russia is pursuing global prestige, it's boasting that 50 countries are interested in its COVID-19 vaccine.
Rusia, bajo el liderazgo del presidente Vladimir Putin, trae nuevamente alivio al mundo.
Yeah, Russia's vaccine, known as Sputnik V, has proved remarkably effective and has been crucial for Latin American countries hammered by the virus.
Once much criticized, Russia's Sputnik V vaccine has now joined the international arsenal of vaccines to combat the pandemic. In Latin America, Sputnik V seen as a lifeline. Shipments of desperately needed doses arriving to battered countries across the region.
Yeah, so now the U.S. has dramatically changed its tune and will engage in negotiations with the World Trade Organization to lift patent restrictions. But will this change anything? Well, the newly single Bill Gates has some thoughts about that.
And in terms of that, there's been some speculation that the changing intellectual property rules and allowing these vaccines, as you say, the recipe for these vaccines to be shared would be helpful. Do you think that would be helpful?
No.
Why not?
Well, there's only so many vaccine factories in the world, and people are very serious about the safety of vaccines. And so moving something that had never been done, moving a vaccine from, say, a J&J factory into a factory in India, that it's novel. It's only because of our grants and our expertise that can happen at all. The thing that's holding things back in this case is not intellectual property. There's not like some idle vaccine factory with regulatory approval that makes magically safe vaccines.
He's so funny, Bill Gates. He says he opposes lifting the patents on the grounds that there aren't these factories lying around who could just make the vaccine. But reporting from Li Fang at The Intercept contradicts the Microsoft billionaire. He writes, except it is exactly like that. Factory owners around the globe, from Bangladesh to Canada, have said they stand ready to retrofit facilities and move forward with vaccine production if given the chance. We have this production capacity and it's not being used, said John Fulton, a spokesperson for Biolis Pharma, a company based in St. Catharines, Ontario, that produces injectable cancer treatments. Fulton noted that Biolis has spent years buying equipment to produce biologics, and it's uniquely prepared to start getting ready to produce vaccines. The company, which Fulton said is best suited for replicating the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, could produce as many as 20 million vaccines per year, he estimated. Abdul Muqtadir, chair and managing director of Incepta, a pharmaceutical firm based in Dhaka, Bangladesh, has told reporters that his firm has the capacity to fill vials for 600 million to 800 million doses of vaccine per year. He has reportedly reached out to Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, and Novavax. Now is the time to use every single opportunity in every single corner of the world, Muqtadir told the Washington Post. These companies should make deals with as many countries as possible. Other firms in South Korea and Pakistan have also reportedly expressed an interest in producing vaccines or vaccine components. Now, it is true, nevertheless, that lifting the patent alone will not be enough. The rich countries still need to help in boosting production capacity for the vaccine. Over at Responsible Statecraft, Sam Fraser writes, while the administration's announcement is undoubtedly good news, crucial questions remain. Notably, Thai's statement does not say that the U.S. will support the specific proposal put forward by India and South Africa. This suggests that the United States may advocate for a modified or narrower plan in WTO negotiations. Thai's announcement states only that the U.S. will support a waiver for vaccines, not for treatments and medical supplies as included in the earlier proposal. To maximize the benefits of a waiver, the Biden administration must be pushed to support the broadest possible proposal, ideally including COVID treatments and medical supplies. Most importantly, the waiver will require follow-on action in the form of technology transfer and information sharing. While patents are a primary barrier to broader vaccine production, new manufacturers will also need access to key technologies and production information. Now, like I said, the Biden administration's reversal came as a surprise given America's recent history in enforcing IP protections around the world. His own record as a senator and the myriad ties his administration has to Big Pharma, as David Sorda laid out in a piece for the Daily Poster. So what is going on here? Well, it is true that there has been pressure from the global south and from the left more broadly, and that may have had an effect. But the reality is that while Big Pharma specifically opposes this, the capitalist class as a whole largely supports it, because ending the global pandemic is necessary for the free flow of goods and services that makes the global economy hum. Take India, for example, which is being absolutely battered by the coronavirus fight right now. According to the Office of the United States Trade Representative, India is the U.S.'s 9th largest trading partner. U.S. goods and services trade with India totaled an estimated $146 billion in 2019. Exports were $58.6 billion. Imports were $87.4 billion. And in fact, Many of in America's investor class have been pushing for the patent waiver behind the scenes. You see, these big investors have diversified portfolios. They don't just make money when pharma makes money. They need the rest of the economy to recover as well. And according to a report in the Financial Times, quote, the world's biggest investors are urging drug makers to collaborate on developing a coronavirus vaccine to end a crisis that has unleashed market turmoil and hammered returns for pension funds across the world. BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, Fidelity Investments and sister company Fidelity International, Aviva Investors, Janus Henderson, and Amundi, Europe's largest asset manager, all told the Financial Times that they want drug companies to put aside any qualms about collaborating with rivals. Quote, an unprecedented global crisis requires unprecedented global coordination in response, said Mirza Beg, global head of governance at Aviva Investors. So that is likely why the Biden administration feels comfortable taking the remarkable step that it took this week, but not so fast. In order for the WTO to waive patent restrictions, there needs to be unanimity, and at least one head of state came out against the Biden administration's move.
America's support on patent waiver is a big win. But now Germany has thrown a spanner in the works. Chancellor Angela Merkel has opposed the waiver. She issued a statement which said, and I'm quoting, the protection of intellectual property is a source of innovation, and it must remain so in the future. Listen to her spokesperson.
The US proposal to remove patent protection for COVID-19 vaccines has significant implications for the vaccine production overall. However, the limiting factor in vaccine production is production capacity and high-quality standards, not patents.
So even during a global health crisis, Germany wants to keep patents locked.
That's right. The world's ultimate girl boss, Angela Merkel, who many saw as the true leader of the free world during the Trump years, came out strongly against waiving vaccine patent protections. And Germany could single-handedly block the waiver at the WTO because, again, they need unanimity. Interesting, right? Well, let's go back to what I just said about the pharma investors and their diversified portfolios. Well, according to a tweet by Martin Schmaltz, an economist at the University of Oxford, quote, fun fact, the German vaccine manufacturer BioNTech's largest shareholders only benefit from BioNTech profits. They don't hold huge stakes in the rest of the world's equities. You know what? It just really goes to show that you really can't go wrong with Thomas Ferguson's investment theory of politics. Look it up. But still, regardless of the motivation, this is a very positive step. It is, in a sense, the beginning of the end of the global pandemic. There is still a lot to do in terms of manufacturing and distribution, but waiving the patents is a crucial first step. And taking a step back, it sets a pretty important precedent, one that worries at least one pharma CEO.
The news grabbed the attention of a former Allergan CEO, Brent Saunders. He tweeted in response, who will make the next vaccine the next time? Brent Saunders is now the chairman and CEO of Vesper Healthcare, joins us now on the Fast Line. Brent, always great to get your perspective.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Melissa.
Do you think that's the way the industry will read this? You're ripping away our intellectual property, basically, whenever you want to, and what's the incentive to have it in the first place?
Well, I mean, I was being rhetorical on Twitter, but I do think it's a slippery slope, and the more we erode our intellectual property protections in the United States, the more we decline as a knowledge-based economy. And so when you're talking about investing billions of dollars to try to solve unmet medical need or cure disease, why would you want to rob companies of the intellectual property protections that come with that investment? And this is not about getting poor countries vaccines. This is about political theater.
You know, and he is probably right that this will be a disincentive for private companies to develop drugs and vaccines. But is that such a bad thing? In fact, I argue that we should probably throw more soap on that slippery slope to make it even slipperier. You know, it was the profit motive itself that left us vulnerable to a global pandemic in the first place. Scientists have warned about the risk of a novel coronavirus for years. The technology for the vaccine was there. So why wasn't it developed? Well, because it was too much money up front and the returns were too risky for private companies. You see, you could spend billions of dollars developing the vaccine, and then the pandemic may or may not come for another decade or 2 decades. But governments didn't step in to fill the gap until it was too late. Removing the profit motive entirely from global health will allow us to make the kind of public investments we need to prevent this kind of thing from ever happening again.
Snaps to that. Definitely agree with your assessment. You know, what's also pretty depressing was the fact that I allowed myself to have a moment of hope in regard to the Biden administration. But as you perfectly laid out, it wasn't public pressure, but rather pressure from capital that persuaded him to change his mind on lifting or waiving the patent. Again, it's depressing, but it's the reality of the situation. It's better to know about it than to be delusional about how much power we really have. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention is just how savvy both Russia and China are in their efforts to carry out their foreign policy interests, right? In the United States, we use brute force, we use military power, whereas in this case, they're clearly using collaboration, humanitarian efforts, diplomacy in order to accumulate power for themselves. Like, there's really no question about that. And it's, in my opinion, a much smarter move. And then one final thing that I'll mention, you know, Brent Saunders, the CEO of Vesper. You know, it's true that, and I agree that if they feel that patents can be waived by governments just willy-nilly, sure, I guess it does create a disincentive to create these vaccines. But what always gets left out of the conversation, or at least what the follow-up I would love to see from reporters who are handling those types of interviews is, where did you get your seed money from? Right? Because they talk about like, oh, we just take on a tremendous amount of risk in developing these drugs, but there's never a conversation about where the funding for the research and development for those drugs really came from. They act as though they're investing their money into these, risky developments, but that's actually really not the case.
Yeah, and this is true not just for manufacturing drugs and vaccines. I mean, this is just a very kind of stark case in which the public sector actually funded a huge percentage of the vaccine development, and these private companies expect to keep all the profits, even though they put in none of the risk. But that's kind of been par for the course for a long time in capitalist development for a while now. The truth is that a lot of these very capital intensive developments were done by the public sector, and then kind of privatized for profit for private companies. Like, there's the case of, for example, GPS, right? GPS was developed by the U.S. military. It's a key it's like a key technological component of something like an iPhone or any smartphone, right? That was developed by the public sector and then essentially handed to private corporations to profit off of. That's just like the private sector would never have developed GPS because it required so much upfront money for unclear returns because it may not have worked out, or it was just too risky. So they would never have done it. It was done. I mean, obviously the U.S. military is not the best way to do these things, but it is better than just a private company, which would never actually do it. But we essentially socialize investment and research and development, and then privatize the profits for the few. It's incredibly infuriating. And this example, which is so stark, right? I mean, so many things about the coronavirus just kind of reveal fault lines within the system. And our job, I guess, is to essentially highlight them and then point out that this is kind of how everything has been working. It's just slightly less obvious when it's, things like an iPhone. But yeah, I mean, this one, this could be a slippery slope. I mean, I hope it becomes the slipperiest of slopes, that the slope gets slipperier and slipperier, because we cannot allow private corporations to be the only entities developing much needed drugs and vaccines, because often the profit motive, I mean, not often, but the vast majority of the time, the profit motive is at odds with public health. The kinds of drugs that are profitable are not necessarily the ones that provide the best outcomes in public health. And certainly vaccines are very non-profitable because they essentially make people immune to the disease. Therefore, you don't have to treat them for the disease. Therefore, you can't make money off of them. So yeah.
Yeah, I think you're so right. I mean, it's an important story, not only because of the nature of the coronavirus pandemic and how many lives have been needlessly lost from this nonsensical system that puts profit over human lives, but it highlights exactly why privatizing certain things like the pharmaceutical industry, like the healthcare industry, like these hospitals in the United States that had no incentive to have, hospital beds that would typically just sit empty, right? It would cost money, but they decided, no, we don't need it. Even if there's a global pandemic, we'll deal with it. We'll cross that bridge when we get there, which is part of the reason why we were so embarrassingly ill-prepared for the pandemic. The system set us up that way. And as we can see, there's unrest all across the globe. And the through line, what you're noticing with most of these demonstrations is the fight against what privatization has done, how it's put most people at such a severe disadvantage during this global pandemic. So while the unrest is sometimes hard to watch when you see the brutal force used by local police, for instance, at least you see people rising up and showing that they're aware of what needs to change. So that's, I think, a silver lining.